Hello everyone, my name is Richard Gentry, President and founder of RG Strategic Interventions LLC. I want to welcome you to this module. This module is the first of a two-part series on the neuroscience of poverty. The neuroscience of poverty is an emerging discipline that is critical for those of us who work in juvenile justice and child welfare. It's important for us to understand some of the concepts and how poverty has a profound impact on brain development. The University of Wisconsin at Madison and the University of Southern California has done some prolific research concerning this discipline, and they're making their works available, and I strongly recommend those of us who are working with young people, especially those who are coming from impoverished conditions, to acquaint ourselves with this information. In the previous module in social learning, I talked about the ills of inner city living, the perils of living in the inner cities in major U.S. cities, and so I would refer you to that module because these cities, living in the inner cities and the backdrop of the violence and the issues that people have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, it's really having profound effects on the development of these people. And so when we focus on this discipline, the neuroscience of poverty, what we are learning is that poverty does not only have psychological and a mental impact on the people living in those conditions, but we're also learning that poverty has a physical impact as well. And that is something that is new and pretty profound. So there's emerging evidence that living in poverty may alter how the brain actually grows. And this may have major effects on positive life outcomes. There are many scientists, neuroscientists, that spend a lot of time studying the brain through MRI scans. And what they are learning are that those kids who are exposed to higher levels of violence as a backdrop in their lives tend to have weaker neural connections and interactions in parts of the brain that's involved in awareness, judgment, ethical, and emotional processing. So when we talk about that prefrontal cortex, where people are able to make sound judgments and rational decisions and work from a logical perspective, these are things that our young people desperately need. But what we're learning is that the impact and the effects of poverty is having an adverse effect on that part of the brain. So when youth experience the world after having a traumatic event or a lifetime of trauma, we also call that complex trauma, that deep primitive part of the brain is still acting like the trauma is happening right now, even if the situation doesn't match. They may not be able to respond normally to even mild stress. So the human brain is a very interesting organism, and it's so different from other mammals. Unfortunately, the way trauma is stored in the brain is that it stores itself in what we call the limbic area of the brain. And with these unfortunate events, we know how neurons tend to fire together. As we mentioned before, neurons that fire together tend to wire together. So with these unfortunate traumatic events, they are stored in the brain in a certain way where these neural networks have been created. And when situations occur in the here and now that are similar or that can trigger those networks that have been established many years ago, these kids respond and act in a way whereas if that event, that traumatic event from yesterday, is actually happening in the here and now. So when these things happen, time does not have an impact or an effect on events. So what we are learning, especially with those kids living, who come from these poverty-stricken areas, who have been exposed to so many unfortunate events. Many of them have been severely abused by caregivers and neglected. Unfortunately, they have had to sell their bodies for food and shelter. They live in adverse conditions. They're parking and living with people oftentimes that they don't know. They may have to live in hotel rooms, abandoned homes, cars, all kinds of unfortunate things. And because they have exposed themselves and become vulnerable to people who are prone to do mean things to vulnerable people, they have experienced a tremendous amount of trauma. And because of these adverse childhood experiences, these networks have aligned themselves and they're there. And oftentimes when situations happen in the here and now, these networks are activated and these kids are living that trauma all over again. We call these responses trauma triggers or trauma responses, and so much of what we see in our out-of-home placements are these trauma triggers. So there may be a simple confront by a staff, a simple redirect by a staff, or a simple directive. These kind of situations can cause a major behavioral event in our young people because they live a life of defensiveness. They are survivors. Their threat radar is always going. And so sometimes the responses that we get from them tends not to be consistent with the situation at hand. The brain system, the body system may respond and react as if the youth is under extreme stress. Many of their reactions isn't a choice. Now, I am a cognitive behaviorist by nature. That's what I started out in the field in regards to studying. Studied under some prolific cognitive behaviorists, and I'm well versed in that intervention. And much of what we teach in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBI, cognitive behavioral interventions, is that many behaviors, or most behaviors, are a choice. But with this emergent science, this neuroscience of poverty, this research is telling us something different as we study this subject closer. That because a lot of these responses, tend to happen because these neural networks have been activated from many years ago. Many of the reactions that we see happens without cognitions playing a role in how they respond to situations. So we have to be aware of this, that so much of the behaviors that we are seeing isn't necessarily a choice. The brain and the body system is reacting without conscious thought or awareness. So many youth are unable to respond normally to events that's happening in their environment. I want to cite some information from JAMA Pediatrics. This is the Journal of the American Medical Association, and this is some information that they published in 2015. And they talk about poverty and the conditions that accompany poverty, which violence, excessive noise, chaos in the home, pollution, malnutrition, the various kinds of abuse. These issues have been linked as a factor in less gray matter in children. And this is the brain tissue that supports information processing and executive behavior, such as decision-making, problem-solving, and impulse control, social and emotional behavior. And so this is very unfortunate because not only does it show that these kids have less gray matter, but it also shows that, or teaches, that their brain sizes are actually smaller. I want to talk a little bit about this issue of fight, flight, or freeze. Because studies show that there's a direct connection between the body's stress response system and how the brain develops. So in a stressful situation or state, the brain structures shift, neurons in the brain fire differently, and stress hormones in your brain go into overdrive. So I want you to think about the conditions that these kids are living in. So the way they see life and situations that approach them, many of them see these situations as life or death situations. And so the body is geared to protect life or to preserve life. This is a function of what we call the old brain or the deep brain. Some refer to it as the reptilian brain. So when these situations present itself, that can be looked at as a life-threatening situation, these neurotransmitters or these hormones are released throughout our brain and body that can send a person into survival mode. They make an immediate decision to fight or flight. So adrenaline and dopamine are released to stimulate your brain to speak to your body. Your heart and lungs beat and breathe faster. Muscles are invigorated. Emotions and acuity are on high alert to respond to these stressful situations. So in essence, what happens is that your stress hormones are constantly amped up. And for many of these kids who are dealing with one stressful situation to another, and to another, they're constantly living in survival mode, and their defenses are always amped up. And basically, because of these stress hormones that are constantly being released, we're finding through these studies, these MRI studies, that it's having an adverse effect on how the brain develops. And that's a very unfortunate situation. So when this happens on a continuous basis with these people who are living under these conditions, the body tends to have a very difficult time in turning down the volume. There's a membrane deep inside the limbic system called the amygdala. Oftentimes it is referred to as a smoke detector, always assessing the environment for threat. Just like a smoke detector, that if a smoke hits that detector, it's going to go off. So for a lot of the people that we're working with, that amygdala is always on high alert. It's always looking for threat because the neurons within the amygdala has simply been programmed to access that threat on a continuous basis. So such chronic stress will impede the development of stem cells, of brain connections, neurons, and eventually the gray matter. And so the brain may actually form to be smaller and deficient. So it's not a matter of those who live in the inner cities are not as smart as people who live in suburban areas or rural areas, but their situation, the conditions that they're living under. Will learning has a profound effect, not only in a psychological way, but also it has a profound effect in a physical way. That's why I oftentimes say that living in the inner city is a public health crisis, and it needs to be addressed. So hopefully more attention will be focused on this. I am strongly encouraging you, as you are reviewing this module, to do further research on this emerging science. I think that it'll be a strong benefit to you to have a better understanding of these people that we are working with, these young people, and will be better able to respond. So let's talk about a few responses that we should that we should implement when it comes to working with kids who have been traumatized in these inner city communities and whose brains have been adversely impacted by poverty. We want to be mindful of safety and security. So in the group living environment, in our out-of-home placements, we want to be particularly aware that these kids need to feel safe. So when it comes to policies such as suicide precautions, staff training, prevention of sexual assaults and bullying, and these kind of things, it's very important to lower that threat radar with our young people. They need to feel a sense of safety. They need to feel secure. They need to feel comfortable, whereas they're not always stressed out and full of anxiety. And so in our facilities, we really need to focus on the issue of safety. We also need to respect the youth in custody. So just because they landed in our facilities does not give us a right or a ticket to be overbearing, to be dogmatic, to use draconian rules and regulations to keep them in line. But they are human beings that are worthy of respect, created in the image and likeness of God. So let's make it a point to respect every individual that come through our facilities, and those who are in out-of-home placements and in community-based settings. A key intervention is to respect them, to treat them with dignity. By respecting youth, this builds trust and strengthens relationships and attachment. And we know that relationship building and attaching to youth, whereas they trust us, is the key to effective treatment and effective therapy. So we want to be mindful of that. We want a supportive environment. We want to be able to listen and express empathy to those that we work with. We want them to know that they are accepted when we're working with them. They're valuable and worthwhile individuals. We do not want to always focus on bad things. We want to focus on good things with these young people and work from a strength-based perspective. We need to understand that acting out is adaptive and it's related to survival. So if certain needs are not being met with those that we work with, we need to understand that when they're acting out, oftentimes there's a signal that something is not working so well, and we need to give attention to certain things where needs can be met, where we can help them to become healthy and productive people. And finally, I want to talk about collaboration. Collaboration with the adolescent to empower and teach them new skills in regards to how to think, how to act. That will help them to understand that appropriate thinking and appropriate feelings will bring forth appropriate behaviors, and good behaviors will bring forth good consequences, and that's ultimately what we want. So we want to return that youth back to the community in a way where that person is pro-social and can engage others in a positive way, whether it's in school, in their homes, or in the community at large. So that's our goal. But with that being said, there's so much that we need to understand about this population that we're working with. And I think as we embrace these concepts of neuroscience and what we're learning about brain development with our young people will be critical in that effort to gain a better understanding of who they are and how best to work with them. So there's a lot of information that I would encourage you to research. This is just an introduction and some nuggets that will benefit you in regards to this discipline. So as you go forward with your research, you're going to become more competent and confident in regards to working effectively with this population. So I want to thank you for tuning in to this module. If you had the opportunity to tune in, log in through YouTube, I want to thank you, and I want to encourage you to hit the subscribe button. And if you have any comments, feel free to leave your comments, and that will be very helpful to me for future modules. If you had the opportunity to log in through my website, which is www.rgstrategicinterventions.com, I want to thank you for that. I want to also encourage you to check out other modules. We have lots of topics that will benefit you in regards to working with young people. I think that you'll find them as a real asset to your tool belt and the tools that you have to work effectively with this population. So with that being said, thanks again, and I look forward to you tuning into future modules.